This is going to be a quick one about guardrails. So the thing about guardrails is you don't know what you don't know. And as best as you can wireframe stuff out and map the processes and sort of document potential edge cases, you don't know what you don't know. And when I say edge cases, I basically just mean scenarios or situations that could happen that aren't the predicted or desired outcomes or process flows, but they are possible. And those are edge cases. So if you're creating like a customer facing AI agent, an edge case could be that the human tries messing with the agent and tries to get it to reveal its system prompt or tries to, basically just make the conversation go on forever and ever and just mess around with it. And because that's not what you have intended the workflow to do, and that's not something that you had really like built into the logic to handle, that would be an edge case. And if you don't have the guardrails set up, you could end up spending a lot of credits on that run. Or you could end up having the agent like leak some sort of data or something. That's pretty extreme. But that's the whole principle of like identifying edge cases is the first part. And then you think to yourself, if this happens, what can I do in my workflow to make sure that if that does happen, we're fine? And that comes in many different flavors. We have a couple that I wanted to show you guys today, and this is obviously nowhere near all of them. But these are just kind of the first ones that have come to my mind. And they can all be tweaked a little bit. But really, like I said, the whole point of this is you would finish your automation. And that's why you have like a QA phase, a quality assurance phase, is because you're not going to finish the automation and then put it into production. You're going to test it with 100 prompts and 100 use cases. You're going to have your team test it. You're going to have the client that you're working with test it. And that's when typically we discover a lot of these edge cases that we hadn't thought about, and that's when we build in guardrails. Sometimes guardrails are as simple as adjusting the system prompt. If you built it out pretty robust in the first place, then that is typically what these guardrails typically look like. But there are lots of times when you have to make some changes to the actual infrastructure because you didn't think about certain things. So let me just walk through a few of these examples, and it will start to make more sense, I hope. So let's say you have an automation where you're collecting forms and then you're basically going to go do some research or something. We're going to be getting a lot of emails, a lot of names, and a lot of company names, stuff like that. And that's great. And one thing you may not have thought about is to work in a simple guardrail to remove duplicates. Because otherwise you're going to be wasting credits and maybe potentially doing double outreach. If someone submits a form twice by accident and you shoot them 2 emails back. I don't know. So there's like certain things like that. But anyways, let's just run through this process. So what we have here is this is just I manually set 3 email addresses. So if 3 separate forms come through and we have Jane at example, John at example, and then Jane at example.com again. We're basically just splitting those out into 3 separate items. So you can see it goes from 1 item to 3 items. And then all we're going to do here is remove duplicates so that we're only keeping Jane and John because we're getting rid of the duplicate Jane record. And so all I did is, there's a node right here. If you type in remove, you can see remove duplicates, and you remove items repeated within the current input. You can also remove items processed in previous executions, which is pretty cool. And you can also clear deduplication history. So that's like a nifty little node here. And that's like a simple edge case a simple guardrail to help you basically keep your automation on the right track and keep everything predictable and working the way you want it to. Because you probably didn't think up front at the beginning that one of the potential journeys through this automation would be that there are duplicate records. So that's one. So here's another one. You guys know I love to use Tavily in my examples. I just love Tavily in general. But let's say what we were doing here is we were having an agent. So obviously I'm just setting data here to show you guys. But we were having an agent create some sort of search term that we would feed that search term into Tavily to search the web. So in this case, the search term is pineapples on pizza. And what happens is we're referencing that search term that the agent would output right here in the query. So right here, we can see that the search term is pineapples on pizza. And we see that this works and it's fine. But what happens is sometimes the agent may hallucinate, or based on how the type of query it's making, what it may do is it may fill in the search term with something like quotation marks, or maybe, like a new line character like that, which basically would just be like an enter or like a page break. You can think of it like that. So if it is to do this, and this is now the query that we're referencing, what happens is we are now referencing double quotation marks. And as you guys know, if you're trying to send over JSON, it's going to tell you that JSON parameter needs to be valid JSON, because you can't have nested quotation marks within a value. We have key value pairs in JSON, and if a value has quotation marks, then it's going to break the JSON. So what you can do with something like this is you have this little function, handy dandy function, that you can add on the end of a variable. So you can see here we're referencing json.query. If I add this function at the end, it basically just trims off any double quotes. And now if we tested this, you could see that it would go through once again. So that basically just ensures that, okay, I didn't really think about that up front, but if ever there are double quotation marks, I know I can build this little function in here, and now we're going to be fine regardless. And it's not always just quotation marks. Like I said, it could be new lines or it could be other things. But if you're finding that your requests are breaking for a certain reason, go find out why, and then find out how you can build in that guardrail. Okay, so here's another one. This is a conditional type of guardrail. And this is just not the only scenario. Conditionals are frequent. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a sec. Anyways, let's say we have a workflow. And what happens is, like, we're collecting data to go through so we can either make some sort of API call or we can talk to an agent or whatever it is. And every once in a while, sometimes the query will come through as an empty value. And if that happens, obviously we don't want to send it down the rest of the logic, because it's going to break or something bad's going to happen. So what you can do is you can have these checks where I'm basically saying, okay, is the query empty? If yes, we're going to go up the true branch, and all we're going to do in the true branch is we're going to send the team a notification and saying, hey, this run didn't work. Here's the information about it. You might have to go process this one manually. But if the query is not empty, as you can see now there's values, we can see that the check is going to go down this way, and this is going to continue down the rest of the predefined logic that we had set up. And this can be other types of things, right? So one of the first times I did something like this was in one of my sub workflows. Let me actually just show you guys what I'm talking about. So in a sub workflow, the same time I discovered this, I ended up doing this twice basically. So the first thing I did was I realized sometimes it was sending over empty queries here. So what I would do is I would add a check right here, sort of like what I did here, and I would say, is the query empty? If yes, I'm going to just respond back to the main agent that called upon me and say, empty query, try again. Because this means that, the ultimate assistant called on this email agent. So if the ultimate assistant sent over an empty query, I'm just going to go back and I'm going to say, hey, you didn't send anything over, try again. And then it would try again, and sometimes it would just fix itself. But if there is a query, we're not changing anything else. We're just going to go down basically the path that we had set. And then while I did that, I was like, you know what? I might as well do something similar over here, where if one of these tools errors and I don't know why, I'm going to have it continue on error using an error output, which we'll talk about in like 2 minutes. And that way, if it does error, it'll respond to the main agent and say, unable to perform task, please try again. So that's like another way to bake in a guardrail rather than having the whole automation stop. The communication loop is going to be, still going. So that's one, right? Or sorry, that's another one. So now here, let's talk about continue on error. So what we have here is I have 3 URLs in here, right? So McDonald's, Chipotle, and example.com, which is fake. And so what happens is we're sending it down the loop to scrape these websites. And what happens is the first request went through. So we scraped McDonald's. The second request went through. We scraped Chipotle. But then the third request failed because it's not a valid URL. Whichever one was, example.com is not the valid URL. So the whole automation breaks. And if you have a list of 1,000 leads that you're trying to go through and you scrape all 99 and then the last one fails, the whole automation fails. So that's not good. Sorry. What you can do is you can use a continue on error. Or actually, no, sorry. Got a little ahead of myself. What we can do here is go to settings and make this continue on error. So we have on error, action to take when the node execution fails. It's by default stop workflow, but we can choose this to be continue. Now, if we run that again, Number one's going to go through, number two is going to go through, and number three is going to fail, but the workflow still finishes. And all we can see here is that we got 3 items back. We have the first one, which is this one. We have the second one, and then the third one is null, as you can see. So the third item came through null, but the first 2 still got scraped. So the whole automation doesn't break, which is exactly what we want. But then you can even take that one step further and say, okay, anything that fails, I at least want to get notified of which ones failed. So that's what we're doing here, is we're doing continue on error, but with an error output. So you can see now that we have this extra error output, we get the 2 back up here that worked, and then we get the 1 down here that didn't work, which was example.com invalid file. So that's something that's always pretty good to do with an HTTP request, especially if it's a GET, but also with posts. But anyways, here's another example of what we can do with HTTP requests, which is polling. So sometimes when you hit an API, it doesn't just access it and pull back the data right away like the way that Tavily does. It'll basically, you access it and you start a task, and then it will return to you a task ID. So in this case, we're accessing Flux PyAPI image generator to make a picture of a dog riding a bike. So if I hit test step, what happens is we call it, and it gives us back a task ID and a status, which is pending. And if we tried to hit this next one to grab that status based on the task ID, it would come back and it would still say processing. So it wouldn't be good. What you'd want to do is you'd want to have an if right here, and you'd want to say, okay, if status is equal to, well, it could equal pending or processing. So we got to be careful here. Because if we only have it say, like, look, if we say if it's equal to pending, and then it goes through, true, it's pending, and then it would, oh, why did that go all the way up there? Oh, okay. So you have to be careful here when you're setting up polling. You have to make sure that the logic is rigid or robust or whatever. So if it's still pending, we're going to go off this way. We are then going to wait. Yeah, we're going to wait. We're then going to wait, let's just say 5 seconds, and then we're going to try again to access this image. So now we would basically wait 5 seconds. Hello? We would wait 5 seconds. And then we're going to try again, and now we'll see if it's done. So now it's completed, and we can see that we have our image URL, which is right here. There we go, dog riding a bike. But what we should do is probably say, does status equal completed? Because as you can see, one time it said pending, the other time it said processing. So we're going to try this again, right? Like if I did this like this, I'm just going to make this 1 second so we can see. If I did this again, it stopped, even though we don't have the image. Because the second time it came through as processing rather than pending. So what we have to do is say, does it equal completed? And then we would basically just have to switch this logic. So if it equals completed is false, then it's going to go back and check. So now let's do this again, right? We're going to try this again. It's going to wait. It's going to continue just to go back and forth and keep checking. It's polling, it's polling, it's polling, it's polling. Obviously we did 1 second, so it's going to poll a ton of times. You'd obviously want to set up the wait time to be more realistic. But whenever this is done, and the image actually comes back as status equals completed, then it will stop. So we'll see if this takes like 30 seconds or what. But I just wanted to show you guys like why when you're setting up this polling, you have to know all the possibilities when you're setting up this guardrail. You have to know the edge cases to the guardrail setup. So now it's finally done. You can see it equal completed, so it stopped. And we'll see we got another picture of a dog riding a bike, and this time it looks a little different. That one's cuter. Anyways, cool. So that is some examples of guardrails. And the thing about it, like I said from the beginning, is you don't know what you don't know. Guardrails it's nice to be able to wireframe out your build and implement guardrails before you actually get to that point. But a lot of times the guardrails aren't going to come until you are finished or you think you're finished and you're testing, or even sometimes you're in production and you realize there's a pattern of something happening. And then you have to go in there and just understand, if this happens, what can we do in this flow to make sure that, basically the rest of the automation doesn't break. And these are some good examples. But like I said, these are not the only ones out there at all. So I'll include this workflow down below just in case you want to play around with it and it could be helpful. But yeah, that's going to do it for Guardrails.